everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're so excited to have Tony Renzoni here tonight to talk about his book, his Historic Connecticut Music Venues. I'm just going to give him a quick introduction and then I'll let him take it away. Tony Renzoni is the author of the well-received books, Connecticut Rock and Roll, A History, Connecticut softball legend Joan Joyce, and Connecticut bootlegger Queen Nellie Green, all published by the History Press. This book is the second in his series of rock and roll in Connecticut. Tony was an avid collector of rock memorabilia for many years, amassing a record collection of more than 10,000 vinyl records. He wrote more than 1,000 weekly columns that were published in the Connecticut Post newspaper and on the Connecticut Post website. Tony is a graduate of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, and is a lifelong resident of Connecticut. Once again, we're so excited to have him here tonight to discuss his new book. There will be a signing afterwards, so if you didn't purchase a copy already and you would like to, you can purchase one on the register on this side of the store and get it signed by Tony afterwards. So thank you all for being here, and I'll let Tony take it away.
Thank you. RJ Julia, what a great story this is. The last time I was here, I was with Joan Joyce. If you know her, didn't know her, she passed away in March, and she was a very dear friend of her, a friend of mine, and I miss her dearly. But we got to talking, and I'm proud to say that they actually turned my book on Joan Joyce. I know I'm getting off the subject, but they turned my book on Joan Joyce into a musical. And the musical is fabulous. It is absolutely fabulous. I encourage everyone to see it. There's two big events coming up for Joan, and I'll just mention this in passing before I get into rock and roll. One is it's going to be a tribute to Joan Joyce, September 27th, and it's at the Palace Theater in Joni's hometown of Waterbury. The Palace is beautiful. So we're pleased that we're going to be doing this tribute. Keeley, who does Joan Joyce in the musical, is going to be singing some selections. I'm going to be there to discuss Joan Joyce. And then the actual play will be at the Southern Angels Theater in Waterbury. So we're really excited about that, and that's coming up in the beginning of the year. Okay, rock and roll. I'm here to briefly discuss my two books. One is called Connecticut Rock and Roll, and the other one is Connecticut Music Venues. So I'm going to start off with Connecticut Rock and Roll. And Connecticut Rock and Roll, I can get into why I was interested in it, but suffice it to say that to me it's a book about all of us, because the first 40 pages maybe, I get into these cultural events, which I'll talk to you about. But it's 224 pages, 150 photos, some of them are very rare, and the book is doing very well, as is the other one, so I'm pleased to say that. Now, Connecticut Rock and Roll serves two purposes. The first purpose is to pay tribute to all these great artists that are associated with Connecticut. Now, these are artists that achieve fame on a national level, on an international level, on a regional level, or popular on a local level. But hey, it's all rock and roll, right? You know, rock and roll is rock and roll. The second purpose is to highlight the many cultural events that took place here in Connecticut, which mirrored what was going on in the rest of the country and even in parts of the world. By cultural events, and these are listed in the first 40 pages, I believe I said. But these are cultural events like sock hops, record hops, disc jockeys, radio stations, record stores, and after-school events. Let's take sock hops, for instance. Sock hops, as you probably know, grew out of the fact that teenagers would, in the 50s, I guess, would dance in the gymnasiums, but they weren't allowed to wear their shoes, so they had to take off the shoes and dance in their socks, thus the term sock hops. But as years went by, it got larger and larger, so they became what we call record hops. And sometimes they were outside, and you'd have disc jockeys like Jim Gallons from Connecticut Bandstand would host some of these record hops. And they were inside and outside. So if you take like the Shack in Oakville, you might go to the Shack to see the Wild Weeds or the Shags. In Cleveland, you might want to go to a place called the Hullabaloo and see a group by the name of Choir, which later became the Raspberries, and they became a big hit. And in England and Australia, you go see the Telstars or the Tornadoes or whatever. But my point is, record stores, record hops were record hops. And the music was different, the bands were different, but record hops were basically record hops. Disc jockeys were very powerful and influential people, especially in those days in early rock and roll. And I'm not talking payola here. The tendency was that if they liked your record, they would probably play it more, and thus your sales would increase. If they didn't like your record, they would probably play it a little less, and it would hurt your record sales. Ken Evans, who wrote the foreword for my book, Ken Evans is a member of the band, the Fifth Estate. And now the Fifth Estate had a number of hits, national and international, but the biggest hit, of course, was the number 11 hit back in '67 called Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Now, it just so happened that Murray the K had this call-in show. It's part of this Murray the K swinging soiree. So he would have a call-in show and pit one band against another. Well, the Fifth Estate was called, before the Fifth Estate, they were called the D-Men. Now, the D-Men were very popular. They're from Stanford, but they were very popular in the New York area, near WYNS. Okay? So, in this particular case, they went up against two powerful groups called the Animals and the Dave Clark Five. And so Murray the K was thinking there's no way this group is going to beat up these guys. But as it happens, because of all these fans in that area, they flooded the lines and for the D-Men. And the D-Men, lo and behold, won that contest. Now, Murray the K didn't like it. He didn't take to it because he thought something was up, something was rigged or whatever. And consequently, he stopped playing the records or played them less. And that hurt their sales. But that's not the end of the story. When they became the Fifth Estate, Murray the K loved Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, the number 1 beloved song. So he played it over and over and over again. And that became, that helped their record sales. So the Fifth Estate kind of got the last laugh on that one. Radio stations, of course, that's where people would listen for the records. There was no such thing as Spotify or Pandora or whatever. The kids would listen to the radio stations like WPOP, WDRC, those kind of stations. What I remember about radio stations in those days was it wasn't so much for the records that you listened to them. They had some characters for DJs, and they would tell these fantastic stories. You knew they were making them up for the most part, like somebody's getting arrested or somebody was kidnapped or whatever. But the kids loved it because it was an ongoing saga. It was a really good time at that time to listen to these great disc jockeys. Record stores were, of course, you go into a record store in those days to buy a record, right? I mean, there's no streaming or anything like that. You have to go into the record stores to buy the record. Does anybody remember what this is? You probably can't see it, but it's a record survey. So the kids would go into the record stores to purchase their favorite record, but then they would look on this survey, top 40 or whatever, and the natural inclination would say, okay, what's number 1? So most likely than not, they would, they're spending dad's money, so what do they care? For the most part. So they would buy the number 1 record or number 2 record or whatever. And so it's a win-win situation, for the record stores and for the kids. After school hangouts were very important because after school hangouts was a place where kids would go after school and get together and talk about the major crisis in their lives. I mean, major crisis, like who they're going out with, who they love, who they hate, whatever. Nothing to do with education. But and the whole thing about that was it was free of adult supervision. Teenagers love, and still do, independence. So that was very important. Does anybody remember this little gadget?
Oh, yeah.
To me, this was what probably. Do you remember this? Yeah, I was just talking to somebody. He was a punk rocker, and I had to really educate him on it. It was sad. It was almost sad. But anyway, rock and roll. I'm not sure. But anyway, but this was a transistor radio, a pocket transistor radio. And the beauty part about it is represented independence for the kids. They could put the radio in their pocket, get the little earbuds, put it in their ear, and actually tune out their parents and even tune out their teachers. And I've seen where kids in the back room would play their little music, put the earbuds in. When the teacher wasn't looking, they would start playing the music. So again, this was one of the greatest inventions ever. I mean, it doesn't look like much compared to what's on today, but this, when it came out, it was fantastic. So, so if you take all these artists, right, and you take all the fans, you take all these music venues that I was, cultural events that I was talking about, artists, fans, cultural events, you merge them all together, you get the Connecticut rock and roll scene. And the rock and roll scene throughout the country and parts of the world. Okay? So that's my bit about the first book. But I did want to touch bases on that book also. Second book is music venues. Okay? And this is, I wanted to talk more about music venues in the first book, but I just didn't have enough room. Those of you who've written a book, you know that you're bound by the publisher to keep it at a certain word, 46,000 words. It doesn't sound like, it sounds like a lot, but it isn't really. They want to keep it at 200-something pages. Otherwise, you pay them $50 or whatever. They want to keep it at $21.99. But and I've seen books where it's almost like an encyclopedia, and I didn't want that. So for this book, first of all, I was so honored, I mean really honored, to have Felix Cavalier do the foreword for this book. Felix, growing up, was one of my rock idols and still is. Those of you who may or may not know Felix Cavalier, he was a member of the Young Rascals and then Rascals, and now he's split up and he's on his own, but like the new Rascals. So he knows what he's talking about. And he was passionate about music venues. He was chomping at the bit to help me out with it, and he's a great guy to help me out with the foreword. But this point is that the Rascals, when they're playing, they can tell if their new record was a hit just by the energy that was coming out of the audience, just by the fan reaction. It's amazing. A lot of artists tell me that. And it's true, you do feel a lot of energy. And you can't get that by playing a record. Last year, God bless them, the Rolling Stones tried to do that Zoom thing. It just didn't work. You have to be for me anyway, you have to be in a music venue to really feel that energy. So music venues serve as a place where the artist's music comes to life. Without music venues, fans would be deprived of hearing and seeing their favorite bands performing live in concert, and that would be a travesty if that didn't happen. So music venues are very important to artists, and God hopes, I just hope that with this COVID thing, things get a little bit better. I know in talking to Felix and other big time artists that their concerts had to be canceled or postponed or whatever, and it's terrible. You take a band like the Rolling Stones or whatever, they're used to playing big arenas and everything, to play like in front of 3 people or what, it just doesn't cut it. They don't feel that energy. They're not good unless they get that energy. I remember my first few concerts, and I could feel that energy. I know what they were talking about. I was never in a band or anything like that, but you can feel the energy even before the group would even come out. So the first music venue that I want to talk about, and I'm just going to briefly go over, and I know there might be questions because I'm only going to hit on a couple. First music venue was the New Haven Arena. The New Haven Arena was built in 1914. It was burnt down, and then it was reconstructed in 1927, and then finally demolished in 1974. Now, a couple of things happened at the New Haven Arena in terms of music history. One was famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it. On December 9th, 1967, Jim Morrison was arrested on stage. It was the first time a rock artist was ever arrested on stage for obscenity, you guessed it. And he was taken away, brought over to the New Haven police station, and he was let go the next day. I've seen posters that said the concert was December 10th. It wasn't. Those are fake posters. It was December 9th. And he immortalized the event by a song called Peace Frog, where he talks about the blood in the streets of New Haven. Not quite sure what that meant, but he talked about it. The other one was, surprisingly, especially today, was an event that happened June 18th, 1964. Maria Kay was scheduled to introduce a new band from England called the Rolling Stones. That concert had to be canceled because of lack of ticket sales. That's nothing. So I look at the poster. Okay, Maria Kay, Rolling Stones. This is when they first came out. I'm looking at the poster. I'm going to ticket sales. Okay, what were they charging? They were charging $2. Okay, so that's the way of the world, man. People didn't catch on. Yeah, of course. Try and get to a Rolling Stone concert and pay $2. And tell the person at the door you're only going to pay $2. Yeah. Bushnell Memorial in Hartford was built in 1930. They hosted a lot of rock and non-rock concerts. I've been to the Bushnell a number of times. One concert I remember was an interesting concert. It was a Gene Pitney tour, and the first tour concert was in Hartford, his hometown, home state of Connecticut, at the Bushnell Memorial. The thing about this, what I remember as a kid, was he brought in all these great groups at the time. Easy Beats, Happenings, Fifth Estate, you name it. All these great groups, they sang all their hits. The thing is, they're all on the top of their game. So that my feeling and my buddy's feeling were, even if Gene Pitney never walked out on stage, we got our money's worth. Okay? But when he did walk out on stage, I'll tell you, I've never seen anything like it, because he had such a powerful voice. And especially in those days, but even later, when he was a kid, he had a real powerful voice. I thought the wind was going to break. He sang, he would sing a song like, "I'm Going to Be Strong." If you hear that song again, at the end, where you hit that high note, man, I thought the wind was going to break. In fact, Ken Evans from the Fifth Estate tells me the story about how when they finished their concerts, they would go backstage and they would take bets on whether or not Gene Pitney could hit that high note, and mostly all the time they lost their bets. So that was a great concert for me, and I'm sure there's plenty others. Gene Pitney was an amazing guy, and you should know that. I've talked to many of his friends, many of his neighbors. They all tell me the same thing. The guy was he stayed true to Connecticut. He was kind of a pride of Connecticut. Him and Fred Paris of the Five Sounds, they're true to Connecticut. Even when he went on tour, he'd come home to his wife and the family and neighbors. That meant a lot to him to be from Connecticut. I was talking to a neighbor of his, and I don't know how this subject came up, but one day he and, I don't know if a neighbor or friend or whatever, they went on a fishing trip. And the subject of death came up. How would you like to go? Why it came up, I don't know. But anyway, for Gene's way of going was to perform a great concert, have several encores, and just croak, for lack of a better term. And that's exactly what happened when he was in Wales. He performed his encores and he just died, unfortunately, at a young age. I want to tell you that Gene Pitney was a great performer, a great singer in his own right. And he finally made it into the Hall of Fame. It took forever, basically because they like to have #1 songs or whatever. But his resume is so great. But at one point, because he was not only a great performer, he was a great songwriter. So at one point, his song, Only Love Can Break a Heart, it was #2. It never made it to #1. And the reason why it didn't make it to #1 was it was beaten out by a song called He's a Rebel. Gene Pitney wrote He's a Rebel.
Oh, yeah.
So he had the #1 and #2 records. One he wrote, and the other Hal David and Burt Bacharach wrote. So he was a terrific guy from all accounts, and talking to so many people that he knew. Woolsey Hall. Woolsey Hall was constructed in 1901 as part of the bicentennial. And obviously they brought in a lot of rock acts, a lot of non-rock acts, that sort of thing. And probably one concert that people seem to remember is a concert that was done in 1968, I think it was November 1968. It was 2 performances that Jimi Hendrix gave. And so Jimi Hendrix would come out with his feathered boots, his feathered jackets, the hat, the scarf, and the whole bit. Now, you have to remember, Jimi Hendrix, even though he had a modest upbringing, and he was a very shy person at first, but once he got into it, he really got into it. And his guitar playing was second to none. So much so that I heard a story that Eric Clapton, who to me was one of the greatest guitarists ever, when he heard Jimi Hendrix play, he decided to retire almost. And he said that, I can't keep up with this guy. This guy's too good. I find that hard to believe because Eric is so good. But suffice it to say, Jimi Hendrix was that good too. I asked a friend of mine, Joe Sia, who I paid tribute to in my book. He became a world famous photographer. He didn't know it, but he became a world famous photographer. His first assignment was from Rolling Stone. He took photos of the original Woodstock in 1969, and even his peers loved his photos because he would concentrate on the crowds more so than the artists. And he almost became Jimi Hendrix's personal photographer, and to the point where he'd be walking by Jimi Hendrix and Jimi Hendrix would say, "Hey Joe, where are you going with the camera in your hand?" Which is a takeoff on his song.
Yeah.
And Joe had one word to describe Jimi Hendrix, spellbind, and he was. And in fact, my my thoughts were, when Joe was alive, my thoughts were, okay, you give me the photos, and I'll do some research. We'll go around to schools or whatever and do this. I never thought about writing a book, and it wasn't until then he passed away at a very early age, so I decided to scrap it. And it wasn't until my daughter Carrie and my wife Colleen, they said, hey, you got all this information, why don't you write a book? I said, I don't know anything about writing a book. So Carrie took me down to here, R.J. Julian. She pointed to one of the publishers. She says, that's the one you want to go for. So I have her to thank for that. Another intriguing music venue was in Brantford at the Sherry Shack, they call it. Sherry Shack was part of Bill Miller's place. Bill Miller was he trained trampoline and gymnastics, and Sherry trained ballet and dance. But she wanted to set up a discotheque, her own discotheque. And she was an extremely creative person. Now this is pre-computer. So she finally wore them down and got her wish. And she would make up these great posters. I've seen some of the posters. And so she would pass them around to all the kids in the Brantford area, Brantford schools or whatever. It got so popular that the police that were stationed there, they wouldn't let you in unless somebody was coming out. She did things like paint. They had go-go dancers, and she would paint the legs with stripes. And they had strobe lights and black lights, so when they put the lights on, all you see is these dancing, no bodies, just dancing legs. Sherry herself took part in the go-go dancing, and what many of the artists tell me, and she didn't want me to dwell on it too much, but it's part of her life. She was go-go dancer, and her claim to fame was dancing with a boa constrictor around her neck. And that the boa constrictor, she would keep in the back room. So she did things like that, which was really cool. And Bill Miller's family still has the Bill Miller's Castle in Brantford. Want to touch on Yale Bowl, which handles, I think it was 75,000 people, and they would bring in the best of the best. Led Zeppelin, Janis Joplin, Eagles, and all that. And I will mention this, and I did read it in the Yale News, that the Beatles were banned from the Yale Bowl in 1964. This is after they appeared on Ed Sullivan. And the reason why they were banned is because of a wealthy donor who hated the Beatles. And so he threatened to pull his money out. So that Yale caved and they didn't perform it. The same thing happened up in Buffalo. I'm transgressing a little bit, but same thing happened to the Beatles up in Buffalo, because Buffalo was supposed to be the first stop after Ed Sullivan, I understand. And because Buffalo was chosen because of their very famous WKBW radio station. It was very powerful at the time. But the station managers couldn't pony up the $10,000 that it would, take. So it would have put Buffalo on the map. It never happened. And I'm told that Paul McCartney actually was told not to perform there too because of neighbors' complaints about parking and all that stuff. Toads, everyone knows about Toads. I'll just touch on the one performance that people seem to remember. It was an impromptu performance by the Rolling Stones. They were practicing up in Washington, Connecticut, and they wanted to play in front of a few people in a small place, and they chose Toads, I think with maybe Jimmy Connect with encouragement, I don't know. Jimmy Catholic is with Life Nation. So anyway, they played, and it was a surprise to all the people that were there. I think it was 700 people, but they were there to see local bands like, I think the Sons of Bob or something. So you can imagine the reaction. They saw Keith Richards and Mick Jagger and all them walk in, and what the heck is this all about? Not only did they walk in, but they sang for an hour, starting with Start Me Up and finishing with Jumping Jack Flash. So that was a real cool thing. Nobody knew about it. They kept the secret. How they did that, I don't know. But they managed to keep it secret. Just a couple of this. The Meadows Music Theater is a very popular music theater. It's mostly outdoors, and a lot of artists love that place. For instance, Dave Matthews played there like 41 times, which is amazing. I've gone there a few times, and the one I remember most is a concert that Bob Dylan and Paul McCartney and Paul Simon gave. Bob Dylan, Paul Simon. Bob Dylan went on first, then Paul Simon. Bob Dylan was amazing, and it was the one concert that I went to. Whether you hate the guy or love the guy, there's a certain aura about Bob Dylan. So I could feel that energy in the audience before Bob Dylan even came out. And it was, I can't say it's his best concert because he didn't sing any of his hits, but he got a rousing ovation. I'm thinking, how can anybody top that? And Paul Simon did. He came out and he did a great job with his band. Bob Dylan only had his self with his guitar and a couple other guitarists. And the last one is a new one, and was built in 2021, and during the height of COVID, and it's called the Hartford Healthcare Amphitheater in Bridgeport. In fact, I was going to put it in on the web, was just too long. And hopefully things have gotten better, because a friend of mine, Phil Cavalier, was telling me that he's had to postpone his concerts there a number of times. And then I touch on things like Connecticut Bandstand and Brad Davis show, and I found it cool because that was in 1956, and I was just a kid, and it was kind of cool to see my sister dance across the stage in glorious black and white. It was really cool. I wish I could. So they would bring in local bands, and also maybe Bobby Ragdell or whatever. As a matter of fact, Brad Davis, I still can't picture this, but Brad Davis brought in Sly and His Family Stone. I don't know what that was all about. So that was really cool, and it was a lot of fun. And the last one is the Gathering of the Vibes in Bridgeport. Gathering of the Vibes was a very important and very popular festival. Went on for a few days, and they were talking about when Jerry Garcia died in 1995, and it took off in 1996, and it was done in Seaside Park in Bridgeport, and Wavy Gravy from the Woodstock fame to the MC zone. That was kind of cool. So people loved that. I don't know what happened with COVID. I think they stopped doing that. I don't know if they're going to bring it back or not. Okay, those are my things I wanted to hit. Anybody have anything that they want to share? Any music venues or? Huh?
Yeah, I went to, when I was 16, I saw at Wolsey Hall, I saw Jimi Hendrix at one of those performances. I saw Janis Joplin when she was with Big Brother and the Holding Company. I saw the Jeff Beck group when Rod Stewart was his lead singer, before Rod Stewart became Rod Stewart. And I saw John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra there. So that was...
was that at the, where was that?
Wolsey Hall? That was at Wolsey Hall.
Oh, Wolsey Hall, she was there too, because I know she was in Dale Bowl and other places. Yeah. Some very talented artists were associated with Connecticut and passed through Connecticut, and we should be very proud of what we have. These music venues are not only historical, but they are a major draw for a lot of people. I didn't get into Bob Dylan appearing in Indian Neck. That was a big deal for him. And he sang 3 of Woody Guthrie songs. This is before Bob Dylan became Bob Dylan, and it's considered the oldest audio recording of Bob Dylan. So it's things like that we have to remember. Anybody else?
Well, last year we went to Farm Aid up at Meadows, which is John Mellencamp and Willie Nelson But I think that's the second time they've done it there, and I think a lot of it has to do with Dave Matthews' love for that venue, because he's on the board.
Yeah, 41 times. Now how's Willie doing?
He was pretty good.
He's still going strong.
John Mellencamp,
Yeah.
but Willie sounded great.
Yeah.
Willie sounded great.
Well,
That's good.
he's touring with his son Lucas, and so it's the family band. So it was great that they all played together. But that was a great closer.
Yeah.
And it was a great day.
It's a good cause too.
It was a great cause, yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in? Yes.
I had a question for you. It's more just to, as music listeners. My wife, who's standing over there, who works here, and myself, we've been going to concerts in the U.S. and throughout the world ever since we've known each other and before we knew each other. I spent many years in the record business, but I wanted to ask you a question, just for your opinion as a music listener and concert goer. I find it very interesting now that, and it seems maybe this is true more so in Connecticut than in other parts of the country, but I think it may be widespread as well. I can't speak to in detail about other parts of the country, but just the popularity and in sort of ever-present tribute bands that have made a living off of playing small towns like our town, or Guilford, or Wallingford, or you know where I'm going with this. And I find it very interesting that when you have a large breadth of music to look over, like as we have here, so we're talking about seeing and listening to music of the early 60s or late 50s to 2022. And so you've got all these historic, groundbreaking bands that can be imitated, but if you look back to 1964, there weren't any Elvis. I mean, maybe there was an Elvis impersonator band, but there weren't bands that were that were impersonating other popular music of the day. So it's really an interesting phenomenon that speaks to how powerful these rock bands are within our culture, that they can be imitated and generate an entire almost cottage industry. So that's the first thing I wanted to ask you, what you think about that. And the second question that I would add to that is, what I see happening is that all these tribute bands, they take away from the ability of what I call real bands to get gigs. And and that's why I think you don't have a lot of kind of like real bands or bands that are creating their own material getting any local or regional exposure, because all the money's being spent on wanting to hear somebody's version of Start Me Up. I mean, your opinion, please.
Mixed feelings about that one. That's a loaded question.
Uh,
Do you like the tribute bands?
What's that?
Do you like tribute bands?
I like the music of the tribute bands.
all-
I appreciate the thought and the possibly the talent that goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer to hear the actual band
Sure.
if they're still around. And some of the bands, maybe they can't be around, so maybe that's a good point.
Yeah.
But it's really taken off, hasn't it? It's amazing how many tribute. There's a tribute band
Yeah.
for everybody.
Yeah.
And I do get a kick out of a friend of mine does these Fab Four festivals, and
Yeah.
he'll bring on one after another of the Beatles, but they're people that want to be.
Yeah.
The first 5 or 6 are horrible. I mean, it's like they sing the music,
Yeah.
but it's just not them.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and then the other ones come out with the dress and everything else, and it's fun. On the other token, I try my best to reach out to younger people, because they need to know where all this great music came from.
Mhm.
It's not only the Beatles, it's Jerry Lewis and
Of
Jerry
course.
Lee Lewis and Elvis and everybody else.
Yeah.
So it's good that if they think about it, where this music came from, and maybe they would go home and look for on YouTube who this band actually was.
Yeah.
And not just play the music, because it's all about the money. I mean, if you can make money doing a tribute band, you're going to be doing a lot of it.
Sure.
And some of them are really good. Some of them are not so good.
Yeah.
So I have very mixed feelings about that. Yeah.
Well, then you have the wonderful local artist, the Queen, Christine Ullman.
Christine Ullman, if you haven't seen Christine Ullman,
put
she's a
all those
rocker.
tribute bands
She
out
is
of the way.
amazing. And she's been with Saturday Night Live as the lead singer for 25 years, over 25 years. So we've done some book signings ourselves. And I saw Christine. I was telling you that we saw them at the Cafe 9, and it was Christine Ullman and Al Anderson from the Wild Weeds and RBQ. Al Anderson is great. Al Anderson fooled me a little bit because I shouldn't have been fooled, but he's such a good singer, but he's a great guitarist. It's amazing how good he is. And sometimes he has to sit down, he's getting older. But Christine knocks it out of the park every time I see her. She's a terrific person too. And she's very supportive. I'll tell you, I got a lot of support for my books. And it was Christine Ullman, it was Dennis Dunaway who founded the Alice Cooper Band. It was Al Anderson, it was Felix Cavalier, all those people. They didn't have to. I'm not at their level, and they're Hall of Fame type people, and they want to see me really do a good job because they want to get the word out. But I'll tell you, it's hard to reach some of these younger people. Because it's almost, some of them, I'll tell you, some of them really understand the Beatles and where they came from, and I applaud those type of people. Others, they don't want to think about it. They just want, and I understand every generation is different. They have their own music. I'm sure my dad didn't like Rolling Stones. He was into other stuff. So every generation has to have their own music. But you have to know where it's coming from, you know? And that's what I see missing sometimes. So I want to keep this rock thing going. And so I'm trying to do my little bit in terms of, you know, at least in Connecticut, having people. I'll tell you, when I first wrote this book, I don't want to take much more of your time. When I first wrote this book, people were saying, well, Connecticut music, rock music, how does that work? I mean, is there rock music in Connecticut? I said, oh, you wait and see. There's a lot going on. You know, I didn't talk about Keith Richards and Paul Simon and all them that are out there hiding a little bit. But they're all living in Connecticut, and for a long time, Keith Richards has a home in Easton. But the other thing that gave me a lot of confidence in writing my first book, my publisher's down in South Carolina, and they loved my proposal. The first proposal I sent, they took it, and I said, oh, that's great, because what would I do after that? I didn't know anything about writing a book, but they loved it. But the only thing they said, Tony, and I got a couple of emails, they said, Tony, please understand we're slowing down our editing because we're listening to all this great music that's coming out of Connecticut. We were not aware of how great some of these bands were. And that really made me feel good because they really weren't that familiar with Connecticut. And so we should be proud of what we have growing up. And hopefully places like Cafe 9 and the Hartford Amphitheater, Oakdale, they keep it going. And it's very important that kids today kind of do their own thing, but also understand where the music came from. It's history. You hate to see that. So you're right. I mean, I had mixed feelings about that. I really do.
But there are music education teachers. So my good friend Ray teaches at the high school in Clinton, and he has the history of rock and roll class. It's always full because kids want to come and learn about sort of the history of music. And so
Beautiful.
It's good that there are people who are getting that. When we go to shows, we see multiple generations. We'll see grandparents, parents, and their grandkids at the shows
cool?
together.
We
and
went
so
to
that's a good thing.
We went to see Paul McCartney in Long Island, and you swear you were watching the Beatles, because not only were there people my age, but there are young people and people of all different ages, and you name it. and it was like watching a Beatles concert. So that made me happy. So I want to see more of that, you know. And, but they could have their own music. I'm not a punk rock person per se. I'll concede that some of it is very good. In fact, there's some of it in my book, and the more I listen to it, the more I can understand it. But my real thing is, you know, came out of Woodstock and all that. So, well, thank you very much. It
Thank you, Tom.
was really a pleasure.
Thank you.